To the seventh sign, the last sign in John's Gospel, and the last in the sermon series. This concludes Jesus' public ministry, and the last part of John's Gospel from chapter 12 on involves Holy Week, Passion Week. So I will read to you John chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, and verses 17 through 44. This is the familiar story of Lazarus. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany is less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher's here," she said, "and he's asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and she went out to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to go over to the tomb to mourn. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept that man from dying?" Jesus once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," Martha said, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, that you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of these people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with the strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Amen. Dr. Morris Rawlings was a cardiologist and professor of medicine at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. And he treated many patients who had had near-death experiences. A study of these cases was reported by Dr. Rawlings in Omni magazine, known for its reporting of scientific discoveries. It is no longer unusual to hear about people who have almost died speak about seeing a bright light and lush green meadows and rows of smiling relatives and experiencing a deep sense of peace. But Dr. Rawlings' study shows something equally significant, if vastly different. His interviews with more than 300 patients immediately following their resuscitations showed that nearly 50% of these people report seeing lakes of fire, devil-like figures, and other sights reflecting the darkness of hell. Rawlings says that these people later changed their story because they don't want to admit where they've been, not even to their families. But just listening to these patients, he said, has changed my whole life. Now, he was a devout atheist who had considered religion hocus pocus and death nothing more than a painless extinction. But something happened in 1977 that brought a dramatic change into the life of Dr. Rawlings. He was resuscitating a man, and each time the patient regained a heartbeat and respiration, he screamed out, "I'm in hell!" I think I'd be pretty scared if I were the cardiologist.
Yeah.
This man was terrified. I mean, even though he was dead and then he resuscitated, he was terrified. And he pleaded with Dr. Rawlings to help him. And Rawlings said in his own words, he was scared to death. He was looking at the man's face, and he saw a look of horror in his eyes and on his face that he had never before seen. A grimace of fright that contorted his face, trembling, perspiring, from which peered dilated pupils and this sheer look of panic. His hair stood on end. And the man cried out, "Don't you understand? I'm in hell. Don't let me go back to hell." And so Dr. Rawlings said that no one could have heard those screams and seen the look of terror on his face and would doubt for a single minute that the man was actually in a place called hell. So from these experiences, Dr. Rawlings became a believing Christian. Sometimes it takes a lot, right, for God to get people's attention. He said, there is life after death, and if I don't know where I'm going, it's not safe to die. You know, it would appear that our Lord is still in the business of giving us signs and wonders. And so the raising of Lazarus is the seventh and final sign that John records in the Gospel. It's the most powerful sign yet, pointing the way to the ultimate sign that would both conclusively reveal who Jesus is and show God's glory on the cross. The seventh sign begins with Jesus and his disciples in a place across the Jordan River where John the Baptist had first begun baptizing. And Jesus had distanced himself naturally from Jerusalem and the threat of being stoned to death by the Jewish authorities. They were breathing out murderous threats on his life at this point. Several attempts had already been made on his life. And so a message arrives from his friends in Bethany, a village just outside Jerusalem. It's up beyond the Mount of Olives on that side of the city. And it's a place where Jesus was often staying when he was in the area of the city. And the message read simply, "Lord, the one you love is sick." We're told that the message concerned Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, who had sent the word to Jesus. Now the passage also tells us that Jesus loved Martha and Mary, and he loved Lazarus, and yet he knows that Lazarus is gravely ill, but he decides to stay where he is for 2 more days. I think that's a pretty puzzling piece of information. I mean, it's hard for us to reconcile that with our thinking about Jesus, isn't it? If he loved Lazarus and his sisters so much, why didn't he just drop everything and go? Wouldn't that be what you would do? Our compassion would drive us to do that. But one answer to this question could be that Jesus knew if he went to Bethany, so close to Jerusalem, that he would be putting himself once again in harm's way. The Jewish authorities were out for his blood. I mean, he'd be right next door to the temple, basically. So is he a coward? Is that why he's stuck around across the Jordan? Well, of course the answer is no. Jesus knew that he would not come to any harm until his hour had come. That's what we hear over and over in John's Gospel. His hour would not come until God determined that the hour would come for his death. But Jesus himself gives an answer for the delay. The first thing he says, and this is the part I didn't read to you, but I'll tell you what he said. he said to his disciples that Lazarus' sickness would not end in death, but it will be an occasion for God's glory to shine through his Son. Later on, Jesus says that Lazarus has now died, so the disciples may believe in Jesus. Now, it's clear that Jesus has put a plan in mind for staying behind at the Jordan. Lazarus will die, but through his death, Jesus will reveal his glory. Now, still, this prospect could make us pretty uncomfortable, I think. How does Jesus' love work? Do we have to suffer for his glory to show? But it's clear that by choosing to return to Judea to save Lazarus from death, that Jesus was really acknowledging that the hour had come for his own death. And he knew that. When Jesus finally arrives at Bethany, Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. Many mourners from nearby Jerusalem had come to join the sisters. Among them may have been some of the Jews who had plotted to kill Jesus. It certainly seems that way. And this would explain Martha's impropriety. She gets up in the middle of the morning ritual at her house, abruptly leaves the guests, and goes out on the road to meet Jesus. That's a very unbecoming thing for a woman to do. Why did she do that? Because she knew the risk he was taking in coming to her home, and her love for him impelled her to try and shield him from the authorities who were present. And so Martha, she greets Jesus with a neutral statement of facts. I don't think there was any recrimination in her voice here. She said simply, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. I don't think that's a reproach. Simply an expression of her faith that she knew that Jesus could have changed the outcome if he had been there. But her next words indicate that she was not criticizing Jesus. She said, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Even now, Martha knew that Jesus could do something for Lazarus, who had laid in the grave for 4 days. That's faith. Jesus answers, your brother will rise again. Now, his remark is kind of open-ended, isn't it? It's sort of ambiguous. But Martha, she took this to mean that Jesus was referring to the Jewish belief that all the righteous would rise on the last day together. That's the Jewish belief in resurrection. The general resurrection of the dead, if you will. So Martha's understanding of what resurrection was grounded in the traditional expectations of Judaism. But Jesus encourages her to look beyond that to something far greater. Resurrection is not just a future hope, but a present reality, not grounded in a tradition, but in a person. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, they're going to live. And everyone who lives and believes in me is never going to die. I can't imagine what a comfort those words must have been to Martha at that moment. Lazarus loved Jesus and believed in him. And even though he was now dead, he's going to live. And Martha, who believed in Jesus, was never going to die. For Martha, the light dawned brightly. She understood, and she could answer Jesus' question, do you believe this, with the fullest confession of faith of anyone in John's Gospel. Ladies, this is very significant. It's a woman who recognizes that he is the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world, the one we've been waiting for. You are him. So Martha, after this wonderful realization, she turns on her heel. She returns to the house. She goes over to Mary, and the sense is that she says this quietly. Mary, the teacher's out on the road, and he wants to see you. Imagine the scene with Mary coming down the road. She's not able to get out quietly because the whole stream of mourners come out with her, and they're shrieking these shrill, piercing wailing of mourning. Probably some professional mourners that used to pay people to come and do that. And so Jesus sees Mary, and all these people are weeping, and he displays very strong emotions. And if you look at the Greek text, you see that the meaning is so much stronger than what we see in the modern translations. He was deeply moved and troubled in his spirit. He was seething with anger, really, is what the Greek says. So these verses about Jesus' emotions are among some of the most difficult to, I think, understand in the gospel. It's rare for any of the gospel writers to display any record of Jesus' emotions. Certainly we're told about his actions and his words abundantly. But almost never do we hear anything about Jesus' feelings. And yet in this passage, we see Jesus showing strong emotions 3 times within a space of a couple of verses. And this is highly significant. Why, when faced with the mourning of Mary and the crowd, did Jesus become angry? Well, some commentators theorize that Jesus was angry that the mob from Jerusalem was there complicating the upcoming display of his glory. It was intended to benefit only Mary and Martha. But I think that's not a good reason. I really don't. Because the outcome at the end of the chapter says that many of the Jews from Jerusalem who were there believed in Jesus when they saw what he did after raising Lazarus. So the purpose of Jesus' public ministry was so that people would see and believe, right? So I don't think it was that. The other very puzzling thing is that immediately after this intense moment of anger, Jesus is overcome with compassion and he weeps. He becomes one of the mourners. He weeps with them. He knows he can transform their tears of mourning to tears of joy in an instant. And these are no tears of sentimentality, though. They're from his heart. They're from the very heart of God. So these 2 verses about anger and weeping are joined by a question and an answer. Jesus says, "Where have you laid him?" And they answered, "Lord, come and see." It's in the coming and the seeing that we may see Jesus more fully. Because, you see, Jesus has the eyes of God, and he can see the unvarnished reality of the human condition. The state of sin that has degenerated every life toward death. And in seeing this, Jesus is brought to anger. But it is the wretchedness of the human condition, the fact that we are all sinners and we're all condemned to die, that causes Jesus to be brought to tears. In this one glimpse, we see the one who is fully God and is fully human. The one who simultaneously enfleshes the wrath of God at the face of sin and the love of God at the wretchedness of it. And this is why he can be moved to both anger and tears, by the effects of the death on these women whom he loved and those who loved them. When Jesus arrives at Lazarus' tomb, he was once again angry. He faced death, and the scene was not lost on him. It was the foreboding of his own impending death and burial. The place was the same kind of place. It was a rock-hewn tomb. Remember, Louise, when we walked into that tomb? With a stone, a great big round stone off to the side that they put over the mouth of the entrance. And so in the death of Lazarus, Jesus looks at his own death. He knows his hour has come. And he knew that what he has to do, not just in that moment for this beloved disciple, this friend of his, but in the days to come for every beloved disciple for all of eternity, he has to do it. Jesus knows he's going to be crucified. He knows he's going to die. He knows that in his death, he must not only face death and win, but he has to overcome sin. The one who was without sin must become sin for all of us, is what the Apostle Paul wrote. And so this meant that Jesus must take into himself on the cross all the evil in the world and render it harmless. Jesus, the creator of all that's good. And remember what I've told you about John's Gospel. Jesus is the creator God. He's the recreator God. He has to use his creative power on the cross to uncreate all of the bad that humankind has unleashed upon ourselves and creation, and to free us from it. I truly believe that we are responsible for sin. That sin is the only thing that humanity created. And if you think back to that Genesis story of creation, you're going to remember that God informed Adam of the possibility of evil. That evil could be unleashed if he did not take God's loving guidance to heart. And yet Adam chooses to ignore God's love and ate of the tree that God counseled him to stay away from. And the rest, as we know, is history. But before Adam made this choice, Eden was about as perfect a place as could ever be this side of heaven. And I don't think that God was finished with his creation before Adam ate of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because there was the tree of eternal life also. I think that in his time, God intended humanity to eat of that tree, to have eternal life, to live with, and to love God forever. But when Adam chose to follow his own plan rather than God's, he distorted God's intention not only for his life, but for all that God created when Adam brought sin into creation. I think that God had not finished his creation with Adam, because Adam was not finished. And he was not at the point he was ready to eat of the tree of life and live with God forever. And we'll never know when that point would have been. But because of the effect of sin, death, he never would be eating of that tree of the knowledge of life. Adam and his descendants would never be able to reverse the devastation of sin. Once it was unleashed into the creation, there was no stopping it. He had to be the causal agent of it. Jesus had to come. He was the creator who could uncreate the sin. But he also had to be a man. Because the only way for Jesus to succeed in his work was to be fully God the creator and fully man the creation who had brought sin in. So the only way for him to free humanity from sin was to be the God-man. And so when Jesus, before giving up his spirit on the cross, says, "It is finished," his work that began in Eden was finished. Sin was finished. Humanity's bondage to sin was finished. Death was finished. The promise of eternal life, of love, of grace, of forgiveness, rooted in the heart of God, was finished. On the cross, he finished his work. Think back to the story I told you at the beginning of the sermon. The people who had almost died and had glimpsed what hell is like. The lakes of fire, the devils, the darkness, the sheer terror, the horror, the panic. Everything to see and experience that they had. This is what Jesus had to see and experience. But not just in the severity of one person's wicked life would he encounter that, but in the unimaginable magnitude of all the accumulated wickedness of every single person's life who had ever lived and who would ever live. Can you imagine the crushing burden of such evil? And this is the kind of evil that Jesus was facing at the tomb of Lazarus that made him angry. As God, he knew that he had the power to overcome it. But as a full-blooded human being, he knew he had to fully experience it. And knowing that every person faces the kind of evil but is powerless to overcome it, made him weep. And knowing he offered the power to anyone who would believe in him, and still there were those who would not believe in him, made him weep. Now we know all this because we know the rest of the story, don't we? We know the whole gospel truth. But the crowd who followed Jesus to the tomb of Lazarus didn't know what we know. They would not know what was coming. They only knew what they saw. See how he loved him. The crowd exclaimed when he cried. They understood in the simplest form that Jesus' message and the reason why he had come is because he loves us. Because he loves you and me. He calls each one of us his beloved. And those who choose to follow him are each one of us his beloved disciple. So this is the power of the seventh sign. It points all of Jesus' disciples to the final sign of the cross, where his real salvation work happened for us. On the cross, Jesus died to show us the way to resurrection, not resuscitation, as Lazarus was resuscitated only to die again. But in Jesus, all those who die will never again die, because he opened the way to living eternally. So Jesus stands before the tomb. The beloved disciple is inside. And because he loved Lazarus, Jesus called him forth. Lazarus, come out. Do you hear him calling to you? What he did for Lazarus, he does for you and me. Imagine, if you can, your own death. Remember the chilling words of Dr. Rawlings I quoted earlier. There is life after death, and if I don't know where I'm going, it isn't safe to die. God himself has set you this choice. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life. Jesus made the choice possible for you. We can choose where we're going to spend eternity, in that horrible place of evil, fire, darkness, and eternal torture, or in the presence of light and peace and love and joy. And Jesus himself blazed the trail for you. He was the sign pointing us to the choice. And he, as the God-man, has fully experienced both choices. Now it's up to us. Let's pray.